I want to talk about innovation and the collaborative nature of innovation and the new forms of collaboration that are possible thanks to services like the ones that Dave was talking about. A lot of these ideas are drawn from this relatively new book of mine, Where Good Ideas Come From, which is a book about unusually innovative platforms and environments and organizations and spaces in history that tries to figure out what are the kind of core properties, the kind of recurring patterns that you see in all these environments. And one of the big themes of the book is that we are at a wonderful kind of threshold here where there is a great opportunity for a renaissance in public sector innovation. That governments actually have an opportunity to be innovative in a way that perhaps historically they've been less capable of doing. And so really it's a celebration of precisely what you all are here to think about today. And I thought what I would do is start by talking about how I got to this project, how I started thinking about these issues. And it dates back actually to a book that I wrote about 5 or 6 years ago called The Ghost Map, which is a story, a true story of a cholera outbreak in London, and an idea that came out of that terrible disease epidemic that truly changed the world and made the world a better place and actually involved some extraordinary kind of public sector data platforms in Victorian London. And I also want to talk about it because there's no better way to kind of start a breakfast meeting than stories about intestinal disease. That's I find that really sets the stage really nicely. So this was one of these stories that I kept encountering from different angles. I'd be reading about the history of public health, and I would run across this story, and I would be reading about the history of maps, and I would stumble across this story, or the history of science, and I would stumble. And anytime you, in a sense, keep encountering the same thing from different approach paths, it's time to pay attention. Something interesting is going on. So here's how I originally heard the story. It's 1854, and London, like all the great cities of Europe and many cities in the United States, is being attacked by these waves of cholera outbreaks that are killing sometimes 20,000 people over the course of a summer, just one of the great killers of the 19th century. At the time, the authorities are all convinced that cholera is a problem that is largely confined to the air. This was the miasma theory. They thought that people were breathing in noxious vapors that were causing them to get sick. And so all of the kind of government public health initiatives were, in a sense, all about trying to purify the air. Of course, we now know that cholera is a waterborne disease. It comes from contaminated water supplies. And so you had this situation where all the authorities are trying to solve this pressing problem of the age, but they're doing it facing in entirely the wrong direction. In late August of 1854, in the neighborhood of Soho in London, which was at the time the most densely populated and one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, an outbreak of cholera erupts that turns out to be one of the most terrifying and fatal of any in the history of the city. Within 10 days, 10% of the neighborhood is dead. You've got bodies being carted down the street, and just terrible urban carnage. In the middle of all this, a local doctor by the name of John Snow, who lived just around the corner from the kind of the center of the outbreak. This is the John Snow pub that you can visit now in your next cholera tour of London. He goes bravely in the middle, kind of into the belly of the beast, and starts kind of knocking on doors, investigating this outbreak and asking people at each address, you know, how many people have gotten sick here, how many people have died, and so on. And out of this survey, in the middle of the outbreak, as it's raging, he builds a map, one of the most important maps kind of in the history of public health, truly, really, of cartography in general. And the map basically puts little black bars at each address to correspond to how many people have died at each point in the neighborhood, right? And so you can see these kind of heavy concentrations. The map is actually much bigger than this. But this is kind of the center of it, and there's this very heavy concentration of death right in the middle of the town, including an extreme concentration of death right around a pump, a popular watering hole where people would get their water at 40 Broad Street. And Snow looks at this map and he sees that the further you get from the pump, the less death you see. When you're right around the pump, there's this very clear cluster of death right around the pump. And so he looks at this map and he says, aha, everybody has it wrong. The miasma theory is wrong. Cholera is not in the air, it's in the water. He goes to the authorities, shows them the map, convinces them of his theory. The pump handle is removed. The outbreak stops. A whole series of initiatives begin to purify the water supply of London, including the London sewers, which are one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century. And by 1866, just 12 years later, cholera is gone from London for good, never to return again. So I hear this story and I think, well, this is like a Victorian episode of CSI, right? They're going to people, what's not to like, right? And so I decide to write a book about it and I start to research it. And about 2 or 3 months into the research, what I discover is that almost all the important facts that I just told you are not true. Starting with the fact that Snow did not have a eureka moment standing over that map. He, in fact, had been working on the waterborne theory of cholera for 6 years before the outbreak came to Soho. He'd had this hunch, this feeling that there was something wrong about the way that people were dealing with this, but he couldn't quite prove it. And he kept doing all these investigations. He actually made a number of other maps. And his belief in his theory kind of developed over this time, and he wrote a bunch of letters to the Lancet and to the other authorities, but he couldn't get anyone to come around. And so finally, really, the map was ultimately not triggering this sudden epiphany, but it was almost a marketing vehicle for his idea in the end. It made it so visibly clear. The second thing that I found is that Snow had a collaborator. He didn't work alone. I'd always heard that it's a story of this kind of lone genius, but it turned out there was this local vicar by the name of the Reverend Henry Whitehead, who was this 25-year-old vicar who was not at all a man of science, had no medical background, but he knew everybody in the neighborhood. And he had all these kind of thick connections to everyone in the neighborhood, and for complicated reasons, he got involved investigating alongside of Snow in this case. And it was Whitehead, because of his social connections, he was able to track down a lot of the people who had fled or to get more detail, and he ended up building a lot of the data set that led to this map. And in fact, it was Whitehead who found the index case, the patient 0 at the beginning of the outbreak that had started it, which was a little baby girl who lived right across the street from the pump. And that patient 0 was also crucial in convincing the authorities of Snow's case. In fact, without it, it might not have actually sold them on the theory. And it turned out that the city had just changed its kind of practices and was releasing these new public mortality records where they would show the addresses and the time and the apparent cause, if they knew it, of any death in the city. And these would be published every 2 weeks. It was an open data platform that the city was releasing. They were printing it and handing it out. They didn't have machine-readable, databases that could be tracked. But Snow and Whitehead would go to the offices and wait for these things to come out so they could kind of read through them. It was like waiting for Us Weekly or something. Like, okay, we've got a new set of data points here. And so this map and this idea and this argument I had heard as this kind of classic lone genius eureka moment turned out to be really about the power of networks and about the power of collaboration. In some sense, about the power of governments and sharing information and making that information available to people working outside of government. And so I began to realize that I was basically developing this theory about how innovation actually happens, and I decided to write another book where I took that theory and put it front and center, and that became where good ideas come from. And what I tried to do in that book is to basically pull out, there are about 7 of these macro patterns that I see in all of these different environments, in biological environments, in historical environments, in technological platforms, and corporations that have been unusually innovative. In fact, I talk about Google in a number of cases in the book. So I thought I would talk just a little bit about some of those patterns and then say a few more things specifically about the question of innovation around governments. The first pattern is one that we've already seen in the case of John Snow and cholera, and it's what I call the slow hunch. For some reason, we seem to have almost an innate desire to tell stories of innovation as a eureka moment. We like to hear the story told that way. You're sitting there and the light bulb goes off over your head, or the apple falls from the tree and you've got a theory of gravity. Like, there's something intrinsically satisfying about hearing the story told that way. But when you go back and actually look at the kind of fossil record of great ideas, what you find is that those eureka moments are almost always myths. They've been kind of concocted after the fact to make the story more dramatic. And that really the most transformative ideas are almost always preceded by a long incubation period, where the idea starts as this kind of hunch, this feeling that there's an interesting problem worth exploring, this sense that there's some avenue here that people haven't traveled down yet, and you can't quite put your finger on it, but it sticks with you. And unusually innovative people, unusually innovative organizations have an ability to keep those hunches alive, sometimes for decades, until they're ready to really blossom into something powerful and transformative. And there's a great example of this if that's visible in this slide, I'm sure this is a very tech-savvy audience, so you probably can figure out what this is. The writing says, this machine is a server, do not power it down. The telltale bit is that it says CERN up there in the corner, which is the Swiss physics lab where Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Now, this little sticker was on the first World Wide Web server, back when the web was running on one machine, which I love. Like, you could literally trip over the power cord and be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I turned the web off. We should plug that in right away, right? So the story of how Berners-Lee, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard this, Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web is really instructive. It's a classic case study in the slow hunch. He gets to CERN in 1982, and he's overwhelmed by all the intellectual activity that's going on there, all this amazing people doing amazing work, publishing extraordinary papers, and he's kind of overwhelmed by it all. And so he starts working on a little application for his own purposes, actually, just to keep track of the people and documents and data and ideas that are flowing through this complicated space. He works on that for a while, doesn't really tell anybody about it. It's a side project, it's a hobby. Google would call it a 20% time project, right? And then he puts it away, and then in the mid-80s he starts working on it again. He starts working on something that he calls Tangle. The World Wide Web was almost called Tangle, which I kind of like. And then he kind of sketches that out, but doesn't really develop it in earnest. And then it's not until the late 80s that he starts working properly on something that he comes to call the World Wide Web. So it's a process of about 6 years of kind of this hunch state where he's working on this thing. And the scope of the project kind of grows over that time. It goes from being this very private thing to being a much more kind of global project in scope. Now, it's crucial to this story that Berners-Lee was not building this thing from scratch. He took SGML, the markup language, and modified it and turned it into HTML. And of course, he was building on the kind of structure of the internet itself. If he'd had to invent the internet from scratch, he would have never been able to do it. But thankfully, an amazing number of people, one of whom you're going to hear from later today, had already built this open platform so he could build this layer on top of it. And so what you see when you think about something like the World Wide Web is the sense that, one, he had the persistence to kind of keep this idea going. And two, the world, in a sense, kind of caught up to it. The world wasn't ready for the World Wide Web in 1982. There simply weren't enough personal computers, much less network-connected personal computers back then. And it really wasn't until 1989 that he went to his bosses at CERN and said, I may have invented a global communications medium in my spare time. Can this be part of my day job? You know, right? You had to have that awkward conversation with your boss, right? And so part of it is, one of the reasons why we want to keep our hunches alive is because we want sometimes the external world to catch up to them. The idea you had in 1982 that didn't quite make sense in 1982 might be brilliant in 1989 or 2011. So part of the trick to be innovative is to make sure that the external world is ready for it, the external kind of parts and ideas and consumption patterns are out there that are kind of aligned with your idea. And that takes us to one of the other patterns that I talk about in the book, which is a wonderful phrase coined by the complexity theorist who did a lot of work on swarming, Stuart Kauffman. Kauffman has this phrase, the adjacent possible, which I first read about 10 years ago. I've been trying to fit into a book ever since then. It's a wonderful concept. Kauffman's point is that at any point in the history of technology or human society, or even in biology, if you look at evolution, there are a set of possible moves that can be made at that particular moment in time. Imagine it like a chessboard, right? You've got your stop chess game in the middle of the game. There are a finite set of moves that you can make given the rules of chess, and a much larger set of moves that you can't make. The set of legitimate moves is the adjacent possible of that moment in the game. These are the different things that can be done. So Kauffman's point with biology is when you go back to the primordial soup and you're sitting there looking at these molecules bouncing off each other, there's no way that those molecules are just going to spontaneously form a mosquito or a chimpanzee. Right? There are too many intermediary steps that have to happen on the way to those more complex life forms. By the same token, in the history of technology, there is no way that you can invent a microwave oven in 1650. Right? However smart you are, you can't do it. You can't even really think of what a microwave oven would be because there aren't enough kind of available tools and concepts there to kind of remix and repurpose and attach to form something like that. So part of the trick of being innovative is to figure out what are the possibilities, what are the adjacencies of this particular moment, what are the tools and the spare parts that you can take and recombine and do new things with. And there's a great example of that that's visible here. This is a neonatal incubator, one of the great life-extending technologies of the 20th century, invented in the late 19th century by a French physician. It's had a huge impact on reducing infant mortality rates, particularly in the developed world. But as many of you know, in the developing world, we still have these chronically high infant mortality rates. And one of the things that we can do is to give them access to advanced technology like a modern neonatal incubator, which in many cases we do. We send a $50,000 machine off to a mid-sized African town, and it shows up in the little clinic there, and it has a fantastic impact. You take these premature babies and you put it in this thing, and it just does an amazing job at reducing mortality rates for newborns. But inevitably, this happens where one part of the machine breaks, and it goes offline. And because there isn't in the adjacent possibility space of this mid-sized African town, because there aren't spare parts readily available, and because there isn't on-the-ground knowledge about how to fix a modern neonatal incubator, this thing just stays offline and starts gathering cobwebs in the corner and basically never gets turned back on again. This is a big problem with high-tech aid to the developing world. So a couple years ago, a great group of innovators associated with MIT called Design That Matters decided to solve this problem, thinking about it precisely in terms of the adjacent possible. They said, what are the technologies, what are the spare parts that are available in this kind of context, in a mid-sized town in Africa? You don't see a lot of DVRs, you don't see a lot of microwaves, but you do see a working Toyota 4Runner on every corner. And so they said, all right, let's kind of reimagine all of this, and let's set out to build a neonatal incubator that's made entirely out of automobile parts. And that is what you see there. That is the NeoNurture device, won Time Magazine's Innovation of the Year last year. From the outside, it looks like a nice, friendly, modern incubator. On the inside, it's a Toyota. It uses a fan to circulate air. It generates heat from the headlamps. It runs entirely off a car battery, even uses door chimes as the alarm. So if you can fix a car, you can fix this thing. If you've got the parts to keep a car running, you can run a neonatal incubator for as long as you want. And it's that kind of creative remixing of ideas, sometimes from completely different disciplines, from different fields, from different areas and regions, that often leads to the best kind of innovation. So then the question becomes, what are the spaces that kind of diversify, that expand your possibility space, that give you more tools and more spare parts? And I look at a bunch of them in the book, but one of my favorites is the 18th century coffee house. These spaces have this property, I call them liquid networks, where there's a certain kind of fluidity, where ideas can bounce off each other, and there's kind of serendipitous connections are made, and there's surprising things can happen. And the 18th century coffee house is a great example of this. A huge number of breakthrough innovations happened in the coffee house in Paris and in London and to some extent in New York and Vienna. The Enlightenment basically was built in a coffee house. And there are a couple of, endless number of stories about great ideas that came out of coffee houses in this culture, but there are a couple of reasons why this happened. One is the simple fact that they were drinking coffee, I should point out, because until coffee and tea became affordable in the 18th century, all people drank all day long was alcohol. You would wake up in the morning, you'd have beer for breakfast, and then you would have wine and beer and a lot of gin in the 1600s. And so the entire population of Europe was just drunk all day long until coffee and tea came. Now, imagine this in your own life. If you were waking up and having beer for breakfast, and then you switched to coffee and tea, you too would have better ideas on the job, right? So it's not, there's been a bunch of interesting historical study. This is not an accident that there's a great flowering of intellectual activity when the society switches from basically drinking depressant to a stimulant all day long. But I need to get Starbucks to sponsor this part of the talk. But the other part about the coffee house is that it was a multidisciplinary space. Lloyd's of London was invented in a coffee house. It was a place where the ship captains and the investment community and the local merchants would get together and they would hang out and they would talk about their experiences over a bunch of cups of coffee. And it was an informal space with people with different kinds of problems working in very different kinds of jobs. started thinking about how they could actually do something collaborative that would maybe take this very lucrative but very risky business of sending ships all over the world and bringing back spices and coffee, and turn it into something a little bit less risky. And out of that, the modern insurance business is born. And so it's that movement across disciplines, grabbing an idea from some other field and saying, hey, I can take that and move it over here. I can take that automobile and turn it into an incubator, that so often leads to breakthrough ideas. Think of all the ways in which Tim Berners-Lee's invention has been transformed. He was building a scholarly citation engine. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to build an academic thing so you could put up a paper and you could link to other papers, and it was basically an academic proposal in its original vision. He had no idea he was building the greatest technology ever in the history of mankind for letting your 500 friends let them know what you had for breakfast, right? He had no idea that he was building a social network platform and a video platform and all these other things that got built on top of the World Wide Web. And it was because it was an open platform that these surprising new uses were created. And what that takes you to, I think, is a very different take on the importance of diversity. This is, in a sense, the non-political argument for diversity in your offices and your work lives and your personal lives, right? A couple of years ago, there was a great study by a guy named Martin Roif at Stanford Business School. And Roif was interested in unusually innovative people and their social networks, the people that they knew, that they hung around with. This is before Facebook and Twitter. So he takes two groups of people, the kind of unusually innovative people, and then this other group who, to put it gently, are a little bit less innovative in their careers. And he maps all the people that they know, and what he finds is that there is this very clear signature pattern in their acquaintances, which is that the innovators have much more kind of weak tie, loose connections to a much more diverse range of professions. So they themselves, they work in an ad agency, but they know an architect and a government contract lawyer and a plumber and a poet and a popular science writer. Whereas the less innovative group just knows other advertising agency people. And you can understand why that makes sense in the context of what we've been saying. It's the diversity of those inputs that you're having that casual conversation with somebody who's working on a totally different kind of problem. But because there's some connection there, there's some way you can borrow a spare part from what they do and bring it over and put it into a new context, that something interesting happens. That's so often where the innovations come from. And when you take all of these kind of ingredients together, when you kind of diversify the number of people working on the problems, when you create kind of networks, when you create kind of this swarming sense, what you end up with are platforms for innovation. The web is a great platform of innovation. The internet before it is a great platform of innovation. Now, the really interesting possibility, to borrow a phrase from Tim O'Reilly, is to think about government as a platform. We've seen a number of wonderful examples of this, but we're just at the beginning of it. And one great example comes from this city, comes from the local city government, which was a bunch of years ago. The city realized that it was sitting on all this great data that was vitally relevant to the people in the city, and so they decided to create a little competition, which was originally called Hacking the District, but they decided that was a little weird sounding, so they changed it to Apps for Democracy. And they basically said, we've got all this local data about DC, and we're going to create a competition, and you create an app for the web or for the iPhone or for Android, and we'll give the winner $10,000 and runner-up $5,000. And the only caveat is, if you enter the competition, you have to make the app freely available, right, to anybody who wants to use it. So they announce this, they spend almost no money on it, and in the course of 2 or 3 months, they get 47 apps that are built, all functional, all really interesting, and the range of contributions is really great. Talk about diversity. Some of them are very formal, official, this is how your local tax dollars are being spent around the district. But then there are things like an app called Stumble Safely. It's a very useful app for when you've had too much to drink at a local bar in the district, cannot drive home. This app will calculate the safest pedestrian route back to your house based on local crime data. A useful app for the citizens of the district, and also precisely the kind of thing that governments have generally not supplied their citizens with, right? I think it's fair to say, right? So they get all this stuff, and they roughly estimated that, talk about kind of changes in the cost and time of this, that if they'd done this the traditional way, they might have gotten 10 apps. It would have cost $2 million, and it would have taken 2 years, through the traditional RFP procurement kind of process, whatever. So that went from, 47 apps in 3 months for $20,000, something like that. So a really disruptive change. And actually now we saw a picture of the old CTO of the district who sponsored that, who is now Vivek Kundra, the CIO of the United States government. So we're doing this now on a national scale. We've had a lot of these programs like that. I'll tell you one other example of a platform that I think is a great innovation for my own city, New York. New York has a wonderful program, 311, that is here too, and is a lot of cities around the world. A couple of years ago, New York started to have this weird thing, which I experienced on a couple of occasions, where you'd be walking around a neighborhood, and all of a sudden, this very thick smell of maple syrup would envelop you in the neighborhood. And everybody would look around and be like, where is that smell coming from? And it would kind of hover over the neighborhood, talk about miasma, for kind of 6 hours, and everybody's like, I feel like pancakes, I feel like pancakes. And then it would go away. And, post 9/11, everybody's a little nervous. So people were concerned that it was some kind of weird chemical attack from like the, Aunt Jemima wing of Al-Qaeda. And so people would call into 311 to, report it and ask, like, are we being attacked? What's going on? And so the city sent out, inspectors to test the air, and they found out it was fine. But it kept happening. And it kept happening so much that the city, I love this, began calling these things, capital letters, maple syrup events, which sounds like a really boring episode of 24 or something like that. And so they would train the 311 operators to kind of let people know it was fine and all this kind of stuff. But it was still this kind of mystery, and it would happen in these different neighborhoods. And then all of a sudden they realized, wait a second, these aren't just kind of concerned citizens calling in. These are clues. We know where these calls are coming from. And so in a kind of modern, somewhat funnier version of Jon Snow's map, they decided to map all those calls at all the different maple syrup events over time. And they compared them to the prevailing winds at each day. And they built basically a very clear vector that pointed to where these smells were coming from, because it was just happening again and again and again in very reliable ways based on the wind, and the smells were coming from New Jersey. Who would have thought? But it turned out there's a fragrance processing plant in New Jersey that processes this seed, the fenugreek seed, which is available in a bunch of cuisines of the world, but in the United States, it's most commonly used in cheap maple syrup substitutes. And so what I love about that is the city did not design 311 as a olfactory maple syrup event detection and tracking system. But because it was a distributed kind of open network where anybody could kind of call in and say, hey, I've got a problem, it was flexible and adaptable, and it was able to kind of solve this kind of funny problem, but also much more serious problems. Because more people were invited to kind of contribute data to the platform, and the platform was able to adapt to that in new ways. I'll give you one last example, which is maybe my favorite example from the book that brings all these things together, and goes back a couple years before Kennedy's "We're going to put a man on the moon," but really it's the event that started it, which is the launch of Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. Sputnik launches on a Friday. News breaks over the weekend, and our story really starts on the Monday at the Applied Physics Lab in Laurel, Maryland, not too far from here, associated with Johns Hopkins. A lot of work done for the military, and as you can imagine, everybody that Monday morning is buzzing about the launch of this new satellite, and what does it mean, and what is our response going to be? So they're hanging out at the Liquid Network, the coffeehouse equivalent at the APL, the cafeteria at lunch, and there are these two kids there, Geyer and Weifenbach, the two 25-year-old kids, and they are sitting with their older colleagues, and one of them says, hey, this satellite, they launched it, it's got to be sending some kind of signal. We should be able to track it down, right? And so their colleagues are like, kids, good idea, I like that. And Weifenbach, it turns out, is an expert in microwave reception. So he's got a little antenna and amplifier in his workspace, and so the two guys go back after lunch and they start fiddling with the dials trying to pick up this signal. The Soviets made Sputnik send a very easily detectable signal, in large part because they were afraid people would think it was a hoax. So it's sending out this 20 megahertz beep, beep. And after a matter of hours, Geyer and Weifenbach have picked it up. And they're sitting there listening to this beep, but it's like the most beautiful music they've ever heard in their lives, right? They're like, wow, this is amazing, And so people are coming by and patting them on the back and putting on the headphones or listening to it. And no point to this whatsoever, right? This is just a hunch. This is just a weird little, let's see if we can do this. So then they think, well, we should really record this because this is history, right? And so they bring out this bulky reel-to-reel deck and they start recording it and putting little date and time stamps on each beep that they pick up. And then they start thinking, gosh, we're seeing these very slight frequency variations between each of the beeps. I wonder, we could probably use the Doppler effect to figure out how fast this thing is moving. That would be pretty cool. And so they get some more advice and they run some of the numbers and they calculate that. And then they think, well, we could probably look at the slope of the changes. We could probably figure that out. And through that, we could figure out the points at which the satellite is closest to our antenna and the points at which it's furthest from our antenna. So they have to get some time on the new UNIVAC computer, the room-sized computer that they've just gotten at the APL to do that. But they get that. They get some more advice from their colleagues. By the end of this process, they have calculated the exact trajectory of this new satellite around the planet just from these simple little beeps that they're pulling down. Again, no point to this, just a cool hack, but very, very neat, right? So word spreads in the office, and a few weeks later, their boss, Frank McClure, calls them into his office and kind of ominously shuts the door and says, listen, I got to talk to you guys about that Sputnik thing you did. And he says, you guys calculated an unknown location. You guys determined an unknown location in space from a known location on the ground. And what I want to know is, could you do it the other way? They're like, what? And he's like, could you calculate an unknown location on the ground if you knew the location in space? So they went off and thought about it, and they came back and said, yes, we could. In fact, it would be slightly easier. And so McClure kind of smiles, and he says, well, that's really good news because, you see, we've got these new nuclear submarines that we're building. And it turns out to be very hard to get your missile to land right on Moscow if you don't know exactly where your submarine is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So we're thinking we're going to build some of these satellites, throw them up there, and use your little trick to calculate exactly where our submarines are and exactly where our missiles are so that we'll be able to fight our enemies more effectively. And so that, as you can imagine, is the birth of GPS. Now, you know where this story is going, right? For a long time, GPS is a very closed, proprietary, military-only platform used precisely for keeping track of submarines and missiles, although thankfully not for bombing Moscow. But over time, it gets opened up in 1982 after the Korean air crash. Reagan actually opens it up for kind of civilian use, and it gets more and more accurate over time. And meanwhile, that room-sized UNIVAC computer is shrinking down and getting smaller and smaller and more powerful, amazingly, at the same time. And Tim Berners-Lee's creation, down at kind of the end of this story, gets unleashed. And over the last 5 or 10 years, all of a sudden, there's all this data on that platform that Tim Berners-Lee never thought about at all, that is geographic in nature. That is reviews of local restaurants and reports on schools and crime maps. And a lot of that data actually has latitude and longitude embedded right in the markup so that little devices can figure out where those things are and kind of map them in interesting ways. And so now we're sitting here today, and I guarantee you everybody in this room is walking around with a device in your pocket or your purse that is talking to the descendants of those satellites, using the descendants of Geyer and Weifenbach's hack. And we're using these technologies for things that their creators never dreamed of because we've built this kind of stack of innovation. And in fact, I guarantee you someone, starting with me actually, has used those satellites and all that technology in the last day to locate a nearby coffee house, right? That's the kind of trivial stuff we're now able to do with all this amazing technology. Because it's been open, because it's created this kind of platform. And I think that really embodies the power of innovation architectures and platforms when they're done right? You think you're just following this little hunch with no apparent purpose, and then you think you're fighting the Cold War, and it turns out 50 years later, you're just helping somebody find a soy latte, right? That's the kind of emergent, open-ended power of innovation when it's done right. Chance favors the connected mind. Thank you very much for listening. Appreciate it.
Excellent. We've got a few minutes for Q&A here.
Okay, great. I'll stay.
I guess my first one to you would be, so you're saying Yelp and Foursquare should take these APL guys out to lunch at some point?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I think that this is one of those cases where, and this is hugely important for governments, both national and local, we are just scratching the surface of what the internet plus location means, right? I mean, we have some areas where we think, well, we've done all we can, we've innovated, as much as we can in that space. But thinking about what happens when you're walking around in the world where all of a sudden all this information is tagged geographically. You know, we've just started. I mean, the check-in metaphor that Foursquare uses is, you know, it's one of these classic cases where it started, you know, with the idea of I'm going to check into this bar so my friends will know that I'm at this bar, but it suddenly becomes this really interesting kind of beacon that you're sending out to the world saying, I'm here, what is around me? And who else is around me, and how can I kind of diversify and make more surprising and interesting new connections through that kind of platform?
Steve, to your university, I followed yesterday morning told me about your book. I downloaded it. I turned it on today on the Metro and started looking at it. I read the first part of it. And the question then is, you talk a little bit about this growth of innovation with the growth of cities or the
Right.
size of cities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, wonderfully, just heard about the book yesterday and downloaded and read half of it on the Metro this morning. And one of the themes of the book that I didn't really talk about is how innovation has historically clustered in cities. So just as we've talked about how the web was such an amazing kind of driver of innovation, cities have also been a big driver of innovation. And there have been some fascinating studies where basically it's shown that per capita, big cities have more ideas per person than, you know, mid-sized towns or smaller towns. And it gets to the diversity and the kind of some of the platform ideas that we're talking about. If having a good idea was all about isolating yourself and being alone and trying to think the biggest thought you could, then rural areas would outperform cities. Cities are distracting and noisy, and you don't have any room, and you're constantly bumping up against things. But in fact, that's not the way ideas work. Ideas are networks, right? And to have good ideas, you have to have a broader, more interesting kind of network. And that's why cities have always had that kind of property. You've got, and the bigger the city is, you've got more industries, more different kinds of people, more interesting kind of collisions that happen. And so part of the thing that I've been arguing for a while now is that as we build the virtual platform of the web and other platforms like that, how do we take some of those dense urban neighborhood values that have been so important in the history of civilization and make sure that they happen on the web? The web should feel more like a neighborhood than a shopping mall, right? And those are kind of design questions that I think that are really important right now. It goes to Twitter in the sense of, well, Twitter, you know, it's interesting. With social networks, you can use them in one of two ways, basically. You can just follow and attach yourself to people who are exactly like you and people you already know, which narrows your range, right? Helps you keep track of your, you know, ex-girlfriend from high school, but it doesn't necessarily help you really. Or you can choose to follow and be attached to a much more interesting range of people than you would normally expect. And that's certainly the way I try and use Twitter and the people that I follow. Like, I try and build this little coffee house every morning, and what I get out of it is actually not news of what they're having for breakfast, but the links that they're passing around. So it's using 140 characters to point to that 3,000-word article in the New Yorker or something like that. And my reading list every day, my kind of ambient, unplanned reading list every day is now really programmed by the people that I follow on Twitter. It's not programmed by the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times editorial board. Oftentimes they're pointing to those stories. But it's this weird, eclectic group of people. Some of them are musicians, some of them are political people, some of them are tech people that I follow. And I try and keep that diversity alive in that space. But it's something you have to choose to do, right? You have to set out to have that be the kind of platform you want to be around.
He's at Stephen B. Johnson, by the way.
That's right. That is my Twitter handle.
One in the back there. With that, we'll have
Hi,
to...
my name is Carrie O'Connor. I work for the U.S. Department of State, and I run an employee ideation program. It's a software to collect employees' ideas on how to better manage ourselves. And I'm a huge fan of your work.
Oh, thank you.
And I often think to myself, as I look around the organization, you know, what elements do we have within our organization, you know, as far as a liquid network? You know, are we keeping our slow hunches and holding on to them and trying to develop them? And I look to see what my program can do to foster the environment that you describe. And I wonder if you have any tips for, you know, how do you take these macro ideas and facilitate them into the DNA of an organization, particularly so as government, we can work more effectively within our sort of firewalls.
Yeah.
As national security agencies, some of us have to do that. But also, how do we do that to better integrate with citizenry and become a more open government?
Great. Well, so many questions that I won't be able to answer in the short amount of time we have left. But let me just say one thing. First off, thank you. the software component of it, building platforms where people can share hunches and ideas, that's really important, and there are a bunch of different tools that are out there to do that. I would say one thing about the physical space. That's the theme of the book that we didn't talk about that much. Architecture, right? How do you arrange the office? And what I'm seeing in a lot of my visits around the world now talking about this idea is that there's kind of this war on conference rooms that's going on, where people are like, the conference room is killing our creativity here, because people go into this room and they put up the PowerPoint deck with the Q3 projections, and then everybody's just like, oh my God. So what people are doing is actually, I've seen a lot of this where they're taking out, they're keeping some conference rooms because sometimes you need to look at the PowerPoint deck, but they're taking out a bunch of them, and they're creating these kind of innovation spaces that are specifically designed for the more creative meeting you're trying to have. It's a shared space, so there's another conversation going on one table over. You get this, it sounds like a coffee house on some level, and there's often, a little espresso machine. And they're sometimes kind of curated with interesting art or interesting kind of things from around the world or kind of displays and things like that, so there are other ideas that are there. And what it says to the organization is that creative thinking, innovative thinking is not something that we're going to do once a year at the creativity retreat where we go into the forest and do trust falls and brainstorm, And it's not that, and the other thing is people sometimes, they look at companies like Google and Apple and they say, all right, we have to model their campus. So, foosball machine. If we just put that in there, people will, be more creative. It doesn't work. But creating a dedicated space that everyone can use to think more innovatively and to really say, we're spending our money here on carving out this in our real estate, I think that sends a signal and actually becomes a really useful environment for that kind of thinking. All right.
Good. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much. Thanks, guys. Thank you.